In the quiet darkness of a sealed evidence room, a single tape recorder clicks to life, and a man's calm, emotionless voice fills the space, recounting horrors with the same tone someone might use to describe the weather. It is this voice, flat, steady, disturbingly controlled, that pulls us into a world where evil does not shout or rage, but whispers. The screen fades in on a pair of cold, unblinking eyes, recorded decades earlier in an interrogation room lit by a single humming fluorescent light. These are the eyes of a man who killed without hesitation, who planned, stalked, and executed his victims with a precision that baffled investigators for years. But what makes this story different is not just the brutality of his crimes, it is the fact that he chose to talk. After his conviction, he agreed to a private series of long, candid conversations with detectives and criminal psychologists. Conversations so unsettling that many who listened to the tapes described feeling physically sick by the end. For years, these recordings remained locked away, too disturbing for public release, too revealing to be forgotten. In this documentary, we open those archives for the first time and revisit the chilling words that emerged from his own mouth. We explore the quiet suburban neighborhoods that lived in fear, the investigators who dedicated their lives to catching a ghost, and the families who still search for answers hidden between the killer's cryptic confessions. As we move through his life from his childhood isolation to the meticulous rituals that shaped his crimes, we begin to understand that his interviews are not confessions. They are conversations with a man who felt no remorse, no fear, and no connection to the world he destroyed. This is not just the story of a killer, it is the story of the cold, calculated mind behind the murders. A mind that reveals itself piece by piece through the haunting rhythm of his own words. This is Cold Eyes, conversations with a killer, and once you hear his voice, you will never forget it. He was born in an ordinary neighborhood, on an ordinary street, to a family that believed they were raising an ordinary child. But even in early childhood, something about him felt slightly off. People often describe children as curious or shy, but with him, the word most adults used was quiet, a kind of quiet that wasn't innocence, but observation. He watched people more than he interacted with them, studied them without emotion, even as a child. His mother remembered that he rarely cried, not even when he was hurt. His father once said that trying to understand him felt like talking into an empty hallway. Teachers noticed early behavioral gaps. He didn't respond to praise or punishment. He didn't form friendships, and he didn't participate in games or group work. Instead, he sat alone at the edge of the playground, watching other children with a stillness that unsettled even adults. As he got older, small incidents began to surface: missing pets, strange drawings in his notebooks, a fascination with crime stories far beyond his age group. Family members brushed it off as odd phases, believing he would grow out of it, never imagining these were the first early signs of a mind learning to detach. Those who knew him described the boy who never blinked long, who never laughed naturally, who seemed to mimic the emotions he saw on television rather than genuinely feel them. And though nothing he did as a child was criminal, there was a cold emptiness in him, a quiet storm forming beneath a calm surface. By the time anyone realized the gravity of what they were witnessing, the boy with the blank stare had already begun shaping the ideology of a future killer. The warning signs were there, they were just too subtle, too quiet, too easy for everyone to ignore. His teenage years marked the moment when the shadows inside him began to take form. This wasn't a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow, deliberate shift like watching frost creep across a window. It began with isolation. He stopped speaking to classmates entirely, avoiding eye contact, refusing group projects, disappearing into the background like a ghost drifting through hallways. Teachers noticed, but chalked it up to teenage moodiness. What they didn't see were the notebooks he carried, pages filled with diagrams, sketches of faces without eyes, and strange checklists titled observations. He was not planning crimes yet, He was studying human behavior with the cold discipline of a scientist. Around this time, small acts of cruelty emerged. A neighbor's cat was found with unexplained injuries. A younger cousin suffered a mysterious accident during a visit, and though the boy insisted he knew nothing, his blank expression unnerved everyone. He rarely reacted to anything: fear, anger, sadness. None appeared on his face. Instead, he watched others display these emotions and wrote down how they behaved. He once told a classmate, "People are predictable if you look long enough." It seemed like a strange philosophical comment at the time, but later, investigators would return to those words again and again. School counselors tried reaching him, but he answered questions with rehearsed politeness, mirroring emotions so convincingly that adults left conversations believing he was fine. But behind those practiced responses, something darker was forming: an internal justification, a shift in logic where people became objects, tools, experiments. His early journals reveal a chilling transition, from observing pain to wanting to create it. It was during these years that the boy ceased being simply strange or distant. He began calculating, learning not just how to mimic humanity, but how to exploit it. Long before he committed his first crime, he developed an unsettling habit: watching people who seemed invisible to the rest of society. He lingered in bus stations, grocery store parking lots, and quiet side streets, studying individuals who were alone, distracted, or simply unnoticed. These were not yet victims, but prototypes. In his interview tapes, he described them with a chilling detachment: people no one would miss right away. People who walk alone because they are used to loneliness. He kept spiral notebooks filled with observations: ages, routines, walking speeds, times they returned home, how often they checked behind themselves. It wasn't stalking, not yet, but it was practice. He learned to move without being seen, to breathe silently, to blend into backgrounds. He became fascinated with predictability. "People are patterns," he said in one tape. "If you learn the rhythm, you can step into it without being noticed." Detectives who reviewed his notes later said they resembled the work of someone preparing for a military operation, not a murder. He categorized body types, walking gaits, and emotional vulnerabilities. He noted which people carried heavy bags, which ones were distracted by phones, which ones looked tired, defeated, or simply unaware of their surroundings. These observations eventually hardened into a system, a classification of potential targets based on ease, risk, and opportunity. Investigators would later find pages where he ranked strangers by approachability, response time, and probability of being reported missing. The chilling part wasn't the detail, it was the calmness behind it. He chose invisibility because he felt invisible. And when he finally crossed the line from watching to acting, he didn't select victims based on anger or impulse. He selected them the way a hunter chooses prey: methodically, deliberately, and without a trace of emotion. The first attack was not planned as a murder. In his own words, it was a test, an experiment to see whether he could take control of another human being the way he imagined. It happened on a cold evening behind an industrial parking lot where the streetlights flickered and passersby were rare. The victim was a young man leaving work late, unaware of the quiet figure following several steps behind. When investigators later walked through the scene, they described it as eerily silent, as if the area itself absorbed the violence. According to his taped interview, he felt no adrenaline, no shaking hands, just focus. "It was like flipping a switch," he said calmly. "I stepped into his path, and I knew he wouldn't react fast enough." The victim survived but was too traumatized to recount details beyond a shadow, a grip, and the sense of eyes that did not look angry, only empty. Police dismissed it as a mugging gone wrong. They never connected it to the boy who had recently turned 18 and walked through life unnoticed. But for him, the attack was a revelation. He learned how quickly he could overpower someone, how easily fear froze them, how predictable human reactions were under stress. He wrote afterward in his journal, "Control felt natural. This near tragedy became the catalyst. Surviving it not legally, but psychologically emboldened him. He became more meticulous, more confident, refining his tactics. And in the months that followed, the line he once tiptoed finally vanished. The first act taught him something terrifying. Not only could he strike without remorse, but the world barely noticed. He discovered that invisibility wasn't just a condition. It was an advantage. When investigators later examined his behavior, they discovered he had developed rituals long before he committed his first murder. These rituals acted as emotional rehearsals, small, calculated routines that sharpened his predatory instincts. He would walk late at night for hours, learning the darkest routes, memorizing blind corners, identifying which homes had motion sensors and which didn't. He practiced moving silently, stepping only on soft ground or avoiding gravel entirely. He monitored bus schedules, shift change patterns, and the late-night routines of strangers. These nightly excursions weren't random, they were drills. In his interview tapes, he explained them with eerie clarity. "I wasn't hunting yet. I was preparing for when I would." He developed mental checklists, entry points, escape routes, silence windows, estimated police response times. He rehearsed scenarios, imagining how victims would react and how quickly they could scream or struggle. Each rehearsal made him bolder. He also began collecting objects that investigators later referred to as tools of control. Nothing illegal: rope, tape, gloves, but arranged neatly in a locked box beneath his bed. His family never questioned it. They thought he was organizing personal things. But to him, each item was symbolic, a step closer to stepping fully into the darkness he'd been circling for years. Perhaps the most disturbing ritual was his emotional conditioning. He practiced staring at himself in the mirror, not to admire or criticize, but to remove expression from his face. "A blank face makes people trust you," he said on one of the tapes. "A calm voice makes them follow you." These rituals weren't impulsive or chaotic. They were deliberate foundations for what he would soon become. They turned a detached young man into a predator who understood not just the mechanics of violence, but the psychology of silence. The night of his first murder was not a moment of emotional frenzy. It was a calculated decision. In his own chilling words, "I wanted to know if the world would change afterward." It didn't. And that realization fueled everything that followed. The victim was a woman walking home after a late shift, cutting through a dimly lit residential path she had used hundreds of times. She didn't notice the figure lingering across the street, watching her pattern for days. He chose her because she fit his criteria: alone, predictable, unguarded. Investigators later described the scene as methodical, lacking the chaos often found in first-time killings. There were no signs of struggle beyond a few faint marks, indicating she had only seconds to react. He moved quickly, with practiced precision, proving his rehearsals had paid off. The murder itself, as he described, was not emotional, it was quiet. What disturbed detectives most was his lack of reflection. He said he felt nothing afterward. No guilt, no exhilaration, no anxiety. Instead, he walked home calmly, cleaned himself meticulously, placed his clothing in a sealed bag, and wrote 2 chilling words in his journal. It worked. Her disappearance initially triggered only mild concern among neighbors. By the time her body was found, days had passed, evidence decayed, and leads ran cold. Police considered robbery or assault, never imagining a young man with an unremarkable face and calm demeanor was responsible. This murder created a template he would reuse: fast, silent, efficient. He didn't take souvenirs. He didn't communicate with police. He didn't crave recognition. His only desire was control. And now that he had achieved it once, the process became easier, mechanical, predictable, and terrifyingly repeatable. As weeks turned to months, more victims disappeared. At first, The cases seemed unrelated, different ages, backgrounds, neighborhoods. But fear began to spread in ways that statistics couldn't measure. Parents locked doors earlier. Joggers abandoned their routes. Women walked in groups or carried pepper spray. Neighbors whispered about a night stalker, though police continued to insist there was no proof of a serial predator. But the community felt it. They sensed it. There was a pattern beneath the surface, subtle, quiet, consistent. The moment fear peaked was when 2 victims vanished within the same week, both last seen walking alone at dusk. For the first time, investigators considered something darker, something organized. Yet the killer remained invisible, blending into crowds, sitting in diners, riding public buses alongside people who had no idea they were inches from a murderer. He continued choosing victims who lived on the fringes of routine night workers, solitary commuters, people whose movements rarely intersected with others. His ability to blend in made him a phantom. Detectives launched surveillance operations, neighborhood canvasses, and public awareness campaigns. But despite increased patrols and media pressure, the killer stayed one step ahead. In the interview tapes, he spoke of this period almost fondly. The fear made people predictable. Predictability made them easier to plan around. He wasn't killing more often. He was killing smarter. A city living in terror wasn't an obstacle. It was a tool. And while investigators struggled to connect clues, the killer watched the panic he created with the same cold, observational detachment he carried since childhood. The city was afraid of a monster lurking in darkness. What they didn't know was that the monster was hiding in plain sight, walking the same streets, watching the chaos with unblinking, calculating eyes. No killer remains invisible forever. For him, the first crack came from something small, almost trivial. A witness reported seeing a quiet young man near one of the disappearance sites, standing unusually still, as if studying the area. At first, the tip meant little. Hundreds of leads came in. But this witness described something that later became crucial. His eyes didn't move. He just stared. Detectives dismissed the description at first. Unusual behavior wasn't enough to build a case. But around the same time, another break occurred. A victim survived. She was battered, disoriented, and traumatized, but alive. And though her memory was foggy, she recalled one detail. He didn't talk. Not even when I begged. He just watched me like he was waiting for something. Investigators finally began seeing a pattern, a silent attacker, emotionless, highly strategic. They formed a task force and began tracing the habits of solitary young men in the areas where victims vanished. Meanwhile, the killer sensed a shift. Police presence grew heavier. Patrol cars lingered in once empty streets. People avoided walking alone. He adapted, retreating temporarily, studying the new patterns created by fear. But something changed within him too. He grew careless, not out of fear, but curiosity. He started returning to scenes after police left, watching investigators work. One late night, an officer noticed a lone figure standing too still near a cordoned area, but by the time he approached, the man had vanished. This moment became the turning point. Police realized the killer wasn't just hiding, he was watching them. And for the first time, investigators felt what his victims felt. The unsettling sensation of being observed by someone who felt nothing at all. Once investigators narrowed their focus to specific neighborhoods, his careful facade began to erode. Surveillance footage finally caught him not committing a crime, but watching. He appeared in the background of multiple locations connected to victims, always standing alone, always with that same unnerving stillness. Detectives built a profile. A young man with detached behavior, strong observational habits, and an ability to move silently. They distributed undercover officers throughout the city, trying to predict his next movement. He noticed. And instead of fleeing, he became curious. In the tapes, he admitted, knowing they were looking for me made it interesting. His increased presence around, Investigation sites helped detectives more than he realized. They tracked him through overlapping sightings, cross-referencing security footage, bus records, and even library logs. He had been reading books about criminal psychology. The final mistake came when he followed a potential victim into a grocery store parking lot. An undercover officer, stationed nearby, noticed his behavior. The slow pacing, the fixed gaze, the subtle maneuvering. When the officer approached, he didn't run. He simply said, "Is there a problem?" The officer reported that his voice was calm, too calm. Backup arrived, and though he denied everything, inconsistencies in his alibi and surveillance matches placed him under arrest. During interrogation, he maintained the same blank expression, offering nothing until one detective made an offhand remark. "You like watching us, don't you?" He smiled barely. That was the moment investigators knew they had the right man. Days later, physical evidence emerged linking him to multiple victims. The hunt had ended, but the real horror, the depth of his mind, was only beginning to unfold when he finally agreed to talk. After conviction, he surprised everyone by agreeing to a series of private interviews with detectives and psychologists. The tapes were never meant for public release. They were too revealing, too unsettling, too cold. In the first recording, he sat upright, hands folded, eyes fixed on the interviewer with the same empty calmness he had shown since childhood. He did not confess in the traditional sense. Instead, he described his actions with the tone of someone explaining everyday routines. When asked if he felt remorse, he answered, "For what? People die every day." When asked why he targeted specific victims, he replied, "Because they didn't see me." He spoke about control, predictability, and the thrill, not of violence, but of order, how he planned, how he observed, how he stayed invisible. The most chilling moments came when detectives asked what he would have done if he hadn't been caught. He paused, looked directly at the camera, and said, "I would have adapted." In his final interview, he revealed something investigators never knew. He had identified future victims' names, routines, locations, all written in a coded journal they later recovered. He smiled slightly as he described how easily he moved among people, how no one ever looked at him long enough to wonder who he really was. One detective ended the interview early, visibly shaken. The tapes were sealed shortly afterward, considered too psychologically damaging for wider release. The last recorded words he spoke were, "People look at my eyes and think they see emptiness. But emptiness is just clarity without emotion." When the recorder clicked off, the room fell silent. Those who heard the tapes said the most chilling part wasn't what he described. It was the feeling that he had been studying them just as intensely as he studied his victims. As the final tape ends and the camera lens fades to black, we are left with a chilling understanding. Some killers reveal their crimes, but very few reveal themselves. Throughout his interviews, he never raised his voice, never expressed anger, never spoke of hatred or impulse. Instead, he talked about people the way a mechanic might talk about broken machinery objects to be analyzed, controlled, and discarded. And perhaps that is what makes his story so unnerving. Evil is often portrayed as loud, chaotic, frenzied. But in this case, evil was quiet. It sat calmly across from detectives, hands folded neatly, explaining step by step how it slipped through a city's defenses. His eyes cold, unblinking, disturbingly still held no remorse for the lives he shattered, no understanding of the terror he caused. To him, the interviews were not confessions. They were conversations, an opportunity to dissect human behavior the way he always had. But behind his emotionless voice lay the real truth. His victims were not just numbers in a case file. They were people with families, dreams, fears, and futures stolen by someone who saw them as patterns, not individuals. Their stories echo far louder than his words ever could. Investigators still speak of the weight they felt listening to his tapes, the heaviness in the room, the sense that he wasn't sharing for closure, but for control. And while he now sits behind bars, forever removed from the world he once prowled. The impact of his actions will never be fully contained. In the end, cold eyes. Conversations with a killer is not about giving him a voice. It is about reclaiming the voices of those he silenced. Their memory is the last word, not his.